Hello and welcome to Made Mother Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Andrea Heinz, a sex trade survivor and campaigner. She's the author of the book When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays. She also developed an academic model called Insights from Sex Trade Experienced Persons, InSTEP, which is about helping women to exit the industry. And she's the co-host of the Red Light Exposé podcast. We spoke about Andrea's experiences in the sex industry, how she got into it, how she got out of it, why it is that women find it so difficult to exit the sex industry, the ways in which it's very, very similar to being in a abusive relationship, and Andrea's work as a campaigner around changing the law around prostitution and pushing back against some of the false narratives around it. You can listen to the extended version of my interview with Andrea at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the bonus episodes I do with my husband, the live AMAs that I've started doing. Recently I did one with Rob Henderson, and I've also got them scheduled with Helen Roy and Alex Kashuta. You can log in. You don't have to be a paid subscriber. Anyone can log in and ask us questions and listen to the live stream, and it also gets recorded later and shared with paid subs. There's also the MMM chat community, and I also have a new book out. Well, kind of a new book. It's a young adult version of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. It's shorter, it's simpler, it's a bit less explicit. I edited this because I kept getting requests from parents saying, I want to give this book to particularly my daughters, but sons too, and I don't feel currently like I can with the book in its current format because it's too disturbing, it's too difficult. So my publisher helped put together a new version of it. It's got the same title, it's just intended for a different audience, kind of like 14 to 17 sort of age range, and it's very much intended to be gifted. I would love for young people to buy this book for themselves, but I think realistically it's probably going to be the sort of book that is pressed into their hands by parents, relatives, other adults in their lives. And it's coming out at the beginning of March in both the UK and overseas. So probably by the time this episode goes out, it will already be available. If not, of course, it can be pre-ordered from anywhere that you get your books. Andrea, could we start by talking about your early life? So I think that you are from Canada originally, is that right?
Correct.
And where did you grow up? What was your childhood like?
I had actually a really good upbringing. When I look back, and especially whenever I compare my childhood to that of so many women that I've met in the prostitution system, my childhood was really, really good in many ways. But of course, I think as you start to understand these systems, you also then can look back again and start to see these little ways where there was influence that was put upon you socially that made you end up where you did as an adult. But as a kid, I had really good parents. I still have good parents. They were together for my whole childhood. There was never any kind of tumultuous energy in my home between them. As far as I know, my father and my mother were never pornography consumers. We took childhood trips, my sister and I, with them as kids going places. But we did definitely ride this economic boom and bust, which was characteristic of the remote northern town that I grew up in, Fort McMurray, Alberta. And so I think that really was kind of, one of the defining things in my life that made me very scared of money was seeing, my parents struggle so badly financially at points and then, bounce back from that and then fall back into debt and, that on and off energy. So there was that. And also as a child, because of that economic situation in an oil patch town, I was a daycare kid. And then I was later on a latchkey kid. And at the daycare I went to, I was physically abused by a female worker at that facility, and also, exposed to sexualized energy, if you will, by a boy who was a bit older than me, who would expose himself to me during nap time and occasionally have me touch his genitalia. So yeah, it was things like that. And I think those early moments of realizing, about money and sex and kind of the dark side of those things really kind of serve to rob people, women especially, women and girls, of their security, if you will, in the world, and really make us aware of things before our time. I think, when we should be exposed to that. So then, of course, once I was about 9 or 10, I started dressing really provocatively, kind of dressing like the fashion of the 90s with the short tops and, what we were seeing on MTV and all of the media. And then, of course, with that, you kind of fall into that teen culture of going to parties and, dating the bad boys and thinking that that's the right move to make. And next thing you know, you're involved with, young men who are in drug culture, and you start to see a lot of violence around that, and, start to experience violence from them because they're in that cycle. And yeah, then, you're getting taken advantage of financially by them. They're, physically and emotionally abusing you. And, then you end up like me, 22 years old and $60,000 of credit card debt. And at that time, I had no education that was really viable or work skills that could have got me a really good paying job. So I was working 5 part-time jobs and averaging 96 hours a week for 2 years straight. Didn't know how to manage money, still wanted to have all the nice things that I thought, signified success and happiness in your life. And then it really made me easy pickings for a newspaper ad that was ran by a brothel that said adult entertainment, make $2,000 a week. Really made it so that I was, in the ripe condition, if you will, to fall for that luring. So that's how I ended up in the prostitution system, which is licensed and regulated here in Edmonton, Alberta.
Had you had any experience of the sex industry before answering that ad?
No. So the town that I grew up in is 5 hours north from where I live now, Edmonton, where I sold sex.
Mm-hmm.
And you literally drive through the bush for 5 hours, just dense forest. Like there's nothing around. So it's a really, really isolated community.
Are you near where the Jordan Peterson and Tammy Peterson grew up? Because you've got exactly the same accent. And I know they're from rural Alberta.
I can't remember where they're from, but yeah, I know that they're from Alberta, but I can't recall the community, the exact
It's probably
one.
enormous, right? It's like the size of Germany or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Alberta itself is the size of Germany. I think.
Oh, is it really? Okay, that was just a guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
I remember my co-host at Red Light Exposé, Ellie Arrow, saying something like that when we were talking about like the size of Canada, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, my country can fit in your province." So yeah, I never kind of really know, where people are
the way
from,
you casually say a 5-hour drive. Okay.
Yeah, you'd be in 3 different countries in Europe by that time, right? Yeah, being that far remote, like you're really removed from the world, and really all that you see is media, right? Your whole understanding of the world outside of your small little community exists online. So I had like the typical media exposure of seeing like the Pretty Woman movie and seeing like the depiction of like dancers in these nightclubs and cocktail waitresses that are very sexualized and all that kind of stuff. But I never saw any type of like prostitution system activity in my city at all. I learned later we did have, I think we still do up there, have one brothel, but it was very secretive and kind of, you wouldn't notice it unless you knew of it, which, it's still kind of the case in a lot of communities. But we're in a different climate now where it's much more visible, I think, than it was in the late 80s, early 90s. So yeah, not much exposure at all. Definitely not enough to give informed consent to participate because I just didn't know what it entailed at all.
How did you end up in Edmonton?
Well, when I graduated high school, I had been dating this guy for about 3 years, and his mom was a survivor of the Indian residential school system here in Canada. So there was a lot of, I think, intergenerational trauma that he was subjected to, that his mom understandably was subjected to. And so he was one of the ones that became a drug dealer selling crack cocaine and was physically and emotionally and financially abusive to me. He's actually in jail right now awaiting trial for murdering one of Canada's Indigenous women.
Oh my goodness.
So yeah, really horrific person, and not a good guy to spend time with. And so whenever I was kind of hitting my limit with that abuse, my dad said, "This man's going to kill you one day, like you need to get away from him." But when you're stuck in that cycle of intimate partner violence, you can't see a way out. So I actually like packed up my stuff in the middle of the night and kind of ran off to a mountain town in Alberta called Jasper in the Rocky Mountains, and lived there for a while working at one of the resorts. And I just wasn't making any money, because again, it's a small mountain town and it's all tourism. So I wasn't getting ahead. And that's when my mom said, why don't you move to the city, to Edmonton, and we'll give you a small little bit of money. This was when housing was still affordable. And
Mm,
she said, you can buy a little condo and you can get a job in Edmonton. There's a lot more work opportunities and you can, start a new life, kind of away from this
mhm,
guy, away from Fort McMurray, all that drug culture and all those people. So that's how I ended up in Edmonton. And that's when, I realized, okay, it's a lot harder to get a good paying job. And that's when, I was working all these jobs and not getting ahead. And like we know with the cycle of poverty, you just start getting more and more broke. So
mm,
yeah, that was when I noticed that newspaper ad telling me, make $2,000 a week, and just didn't even know what I was responding to whenever I replied to that ad.
So it was the lure of this, for you, incredible sums of money. Because, I mean, this is a reality of the sex industry, right? That per hour, it does pay a lot better than other like low skilled work. There is a really big price, rise per hour if you're willing to try it. It's just, as we know, that there's a reason it pays so much more per hour. It's
Yeah,
because, yeah.
yeah.
So anyway, tell us about going and responding to this ad. Was it advertised as a brothel?
Well, it just said it was a men's club, a gentleman's
Okay.
club. And I always say it's funny because looking back, there was no gentleman there, so I don't know why we
Uh,
call them these places. But
mm,
it just said, like, it was very vague. It said women 18 to 30, adult entertainment, make $2,000 a week. So
mhm,
that was where I thought, oh, maybe this is like one of those nightclubs that I've seen in the movies, right? Where the women are just wearing these really nice cocktail outfits or maybe
mm,
lingerie and they're walking around serving men drinks while other women dance. Like, again, just had no clue that at that time and still my city was licensing brothels and, over 30 of them that were so called above board. So I show up at this place and there's these blacked out, tinted out windows, and it's a large building. So I think, oh, yeah, it must be a nightclub. And it's got these silhouettes of women on the outside. And I go in and it's very dark. And the first thing I still remember it that hit me was the strong smell of cigarettes and perfume. I was like, it just
mm,
punches you in the face almost. And I walk into this area and it's a back room where the other women who were being exploited were sitting in the back. And they all looked very, very sad. But at the same
mm,
time, they kind of glared at me. And I can understand now it's like, you're stuck in that cycle and you're so desperate to make money that you see new young women coming in as a threat
mm,
because you're like, oh, that's, less chances that I'm going to make the money I need to make quickly to get out of here. So it wasn't a very welcoming environment at all. And I've heard that from a lot of women. We talk about this sisterhood and this solidarity, but I didn't experience that early on. And so I talked to the owner and I didn't even know what to ask. Like I just said, like, what, okay, can you tell me about this place? And she said, well, I've got to talk to somebody. So go have a look around because there was no Johns there at the time. So I'm wandering around, these dark areas and there's a bar. So again, I'm thinking, okay, it's kind of like a gentleman's nightclub. But then I head down the hallway and that's when I start to see these rooms that have beds in them and showers in them. And then it kind of clicks like, oh, okay, I think I've heard about this, right? These so-called rub and tugs. So in my mind, I still thought, okay, you give a man a massage and then you masturbate him, with your hand. But I never for one second thought it went beyond that. And so she catches up to me after she was done talking to whoever about whatever. And I still swear I had this like deer caught in the headlights look in my eyes because she stopped for a second and said, you know what we do here, right? And I said, yeah, like you guys give hand jobs, right? This is a rub and tug. And she actually laughed at me and, pardon my language, but she said, no, like we fuck for money. And so, yeah, it was really a culture shock for me because I thought, well, this is so weird. Like I see a City of Edmonton license, like a business license on the wall, and like everything seems to be on the up and up. Like they're not trying to hide anything. So like, how are they getting away with doing this? And immediately I thought, no, I'm not doing this. This is everything that I had thought, right? Like human trafficking, like chaining the women to the bed. Like I'm in this like criminal enterprise. I got to get out of here. And I told her this is not for me. And she knew I'd be back. Like a lot of these women know that it's the poor women, the struggling women that are coming their way, the broken women. So it wasn't very long, and I was back there because I had no other options at that time. I was, maxed out credit cards, no food in my fridge, no gas in my car, and just, I was about to lose my housing. So I really didn't know what else to do at that time.
Did the promise of $2,000 a week materialize?
It did for me, and it's weird because in one way you want to say, well, that was at least the good part, right? At least I did get the money. But over time, you start to recognize that that money holds so much power over you and that it's a trap. And it's what I call the golden handcuffs. It seems like it's so great and oh, yay, it's all these promises. But when you start to actually stop and think, like, well, why am I being paid so much money to do something that can be done by anybody, requires no skill, no education, and makes me feel bad? What is so great about this? But, simultaneously, when you're paying off your bills and you're climbing out of debt, it's like, oh my gosh, this is the greatest thing ever. So it has this really, dark but great energy of duality that you just can't kind of come to a good place about. It really just makes you feel bad but elated at the same time. So, I sometimes think, well, prostitution saved me, right? It did get me out of debt. It did pay for me to go back to college and get an education, and maybe I wouldn't be where I am today without it. But then I also think, like, would I be where I am today without it, in regards to the trauma, in regards
Mm.
to the dissociation, all the internalized shame that we still struggle to shed, how people judge me and look at me even 12 years after leaving prostitution. Like, so again, it's really hard to reconcile the power of that money and the impact that it has on you.
I've heard other women who've left the sex trade talk about how the money, particularly if we're talking about cash, right? So it's like the physical thing that you've been handed by a punter. It has this, like, even though you are often earning more money than you've ever earned in your life, and you could be putting it towards savings, towards big purchases, whatever, towards your future, there's this compulsion actually to kind of get rid of it and to
Hmm.
spend it on to spend it on things to numb the pain, like drugs and alcohol, but also to just, I don't know, to almost jettison it, that you end up with this, you basically don't actually end up earning what you think you should be earning because there's something rotten about this money, which means that it just ends up disappearing.
Yeah, so true. I can echo
Mm.
that 100%. Like, in the beginning, I was told by a woman, like, don't ever get into drugs. That will be the end of you in this industry. And she was really nice. That was one woman I can look back and say, she really helped me kind of understand what I was involved in once I was in there. But for me, I was fortunate that I had grown up in a drug culture in my hometown, that I never had any desire to go down that path. And so for me, there was that material soothing that money provided me. I did, pay off my bills, but then anything that was left over, that, I could have preemptively paid another bill, or I could have saved that money and gotten ahead faster. It was just like you said, it was like, get rid of it now, spend it now, like, do something that tells you, like, this is the right decision and I feel good because I did this with that money. So, I had never in my life owned like any nice clothing that was ever like brand name or anything like that. And I remember I bought this jacket and it was $400, and I just felt like so successful whenever I wore this $400 jacket. And it was like, oh, wow, like, this is the pinnacle of success right here. Like, because I never would have been able to buy this or afford this without that money. So that means that prostitution is good. And
Mm.
I think that really moves you into that sex worker mindset where, you look past all the harm that is happening to you, because that money, like I said, has so much power over your emotions and your understanding mentally about what you're engaging in. And yeah, I've seen women blow that money, beautiful women that really could leave the industry multimillionaires, but the pain and the trauma was just so rampant, and they were internalizing it so badly that the money was really symbolic of that. And so they had to rid themselves of it as quick as possible. And also, I think people think that, hey, you're in the brothel 40 hours a week, you're going to be making that $300-400 every hour for all 40 of those hours. But they forget that sometimes too, the women are sitting there and they may only see one John a day. And for some women, if they're not stereotypically attractive, they probably could make more money outside of prostitution committing those same number of hours. So there's really kind of a large continuum of like how much money you make, how it gets spent, how it gets translated into, so-called successful things in the conventional world.
I've heard you talk about the kind of stages of prostitution that you experience and that you've spoken to other women who've been through the same thing, where you have this, I mean, you've already spoken about the initial period of it being a culture shock. Talk us through that period of kind of trying to reconcile yourself with what you're doing.
So there's a paper I wrote, and I'm so grateful to Dignity Journal and Dr. Donna Hughes, the editor in chief of that journal, because she published this paper that I wrote for years. I just kept going back to this paper over and over because I think in one way I was trying to make sense of my own experience and also trying to get people to understand that there is this really common journey that women who are not trafficked, like I never was, and are not these fully autonomous so-called sex workers with other viable options go through. So it operates like a bell curve. My InSTEP model, which is the theoretical tool, if you will, that got published in this paper by Dignity Journal. The paper is called "On Exiting from Commercial Sexual Exploitation," and I really hope people read it because I think it's quite groundbreaking, and I haven't seen anything like it that really helps to pull people into that mindset of women like me, who I call quasi-autonomous women in that paper. And so it operates like a bell curve. Like when you enter prostitution, most of us, we're at a very low point in our life. And you hear all the glamour, you hear all the money, the promises. Hey, you'll be self employed. Everything's going to be so great. All the accolades that you're going to get. You will be in control now, finally. The men won't be the ones in control. You will be. And so if you're standing at this low point and you look at a bell curve, it ascends, it goes up. And so that's all you can see is all the great things that are being promised to you. So after that entry phase, you enter into what I call the positive active phase. So you take the plunge, you decide to enter the prostitution system, and you start that ascension. Oh, wow. Okay. I just made, $1,000 today. This is great. Oh, wow. I only had to work, quote unquote, work 2 days a week, this week. That's great. Oh, this is fantastic. So you're on this climb, and when you're in that positive active phase, nothing can really knock you down. Like you're deluded, for a lack of better terms. But at the very top of the bell curve is what I call the tipping point. And that's when there's an accumulation of trauma. There's a catalyst, which can either be a positive or negative one. Something has happened where the ascension, the climb stops. And now you cross over, and now you're going down the hill. And that takes you into then the negative active phase. So that's where everything starts to really kind of come into focus in a non distorted fashion where, the money doesn't have the power it once had over you. You've been in that industry long enough that you can now see the truth and the reality of what's happening to you. You can't make those justifications and rationalizations anymore because it's just too real. And then at the very, as you're going down this negative active phase, that's where, again, the depression is setting in. You can't dissociate from your body anymore with the Johns. People are starting to turn against you in your life and disown you or, talk badly about you, and you're feeling the impacts of that. Whatever else may be something negative, right? And then at the bottom of that is the exit point. So, ideally, everybody exits, and we always hope that women will exit without going in that negative active phase. But I personally have never seen it. I've never seen a woman who is on the ascension, on the climb, and then just leaves, right? So the model that I created highlights different points of interception where people can deliver exit service provision to these women and at what points they will be most effective. So I really hope, counselors read this model and the paper and can kind of understand, because we need more exit services for those in prostitution, but they do also have to be appropriately timed.
Can you give us an example of an exiting intervention that can work at a
Yeah.
particular point on the bell curve?
Yeah. So the entry phase is one point
Mm-hmm.
before they start the positive active. That's a point where you can really kind of talk somebody out of it, for a lack of better words. You can
Mm-hmm.
show them the truth so that they don't have to get swallowed up and experience it firsthand and then live with the repercussions after the fact. So those ones, of course, are I think mostly economic. That's a really big thing, because we know that for most women, they're not calling the brothel ads just to have sex with random men. They're calling them because they are economically destitute, just like I was and every woman I
Mm-hmm.
knew was, and
Mm-hmm.
still know. So economic is the big one. Whenever it's the second part of the negative active phase, because that part is split into two. The first one, you're still kind of rationalizing everything that has happened and you're trying to get back to the positive active phase. But the second stage of the negative active phase, you're not in denial anymore. Now you're just desperate to leave, and you're not making excuses anymore. That one, really, I find a lot of it comes down to trauma therapy and building self-esteem in women. Because when you're in that cycle, you can't see the way out. You are feeling so helpless and you're really in this, repeating cycle. So that one, of course, economic is important as well, but it's really about getting women to have the confidence in themselves and the self-worth, and helping them to find that in them again whenever it's been taken by the men who have abused them for however long they've been in the system. And then the exit one, the exit phase, that's the third point of interception. Again, economic, because it's hard to transition from making, for example, $300 an hour to like $30 an hour. So
Mm.
the economics are always a part of it. But that one is really more so about reintegration into the conventional workforce, and especially if you apply the second, like the negative active phase, uh, exit support, where it's helping to build up their confidence and their self-worth, then really the next stage when they're exiting, if you continue those exit services, that really needs to be about like exploring who they are as a person in society and what skills they have to offer and what they want to do with their lives outside of this system of exploitation. So they really need long-term supports, and that's what we're not seeing. And I think people think it's like one, quick fix, but it really takes years of restoring them to, or even creating for the first time, confidence in them that they never had, and then taking that and building off of that to help them to explore, their skills that they innately have that they can apply later after exiting.
It sounds so much like exiting an abusive relationship.
Yes, yeah,
This
very
this
similar.
Yeah, and the same model as well of like kind of being love bombed, except you're being
Mhm.
love bombed by the money in this instance rather than by an abuser. And I guess maybe that's a way for people to better understand this, because people, they know about trafficking, they know about women who are forced, like really forced at gunpoint into this. They know about the women who are presented as being enthusiastic and completely willing participants in the sex industry. But what you're describing is a much murkier middle ground where women are initially drawn to the sex industry because of economic deprivation, but then they end up in this, trapped in it for psychological reasons as well,
Yeah.
which do sound so much like, the way that battered women feel about abusers.
Mhm. Yeah, and I often say it's very much like intimate partner violence, but the difference is that you have multiple abusers rather than one,
Yeah.
and people think that that's not as bad. They think that, they can't get such a tight grip on you if it's many, if it's diluted the abuse that you're experiencing. But I really don't see any difference. It's just a changing face, but it's the same actions, the same words, the same conduct that these men are inflicting upon women. They find the weakness and they exploit it, and they know it's money for the most of the time, or they know it's low self-esteem. So Johns love bomb women in prostitution so much, even though we know that really deep down they detest them. And we know that just for the fact that they're purchasing their bodies for one-sided sexual use. But yeah, it's hard for people to try to say, like, or it's hard to see people try to argue that it's day and night, and that there isn't some kind of abuse that's still happening even in that 30-minute time or 1 hour time that you're in the room with these men who really by default are almost all the same in their conduct.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. I had a guy on the podcast recently called Arik Bruckner, who has developed an app called Choice, which is about, basically it's like a companionship app, largely for the sex industry, which is designed to be as safe as possible. And it does sound as if they've put in some quite impressive safety tech, to make sure that this person is who they say they are, and that you can ban people permanently from the platform, they don't just keep coming back and so on. But the argument I tried to make in our conversation, I don't know if he was convinced, was that it's obviously good to reduce violence. It's obviously good to reduce, say, risk of STDs. There's like aggravation that you can reduce, but that really the abuse is the sex itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if he was convinced.
Yeah, that's a hard one to convince a lot of people of, is to see the innate harm and the human rights violation that, is inherent to the prostitution exchange when one person is reduced to a sexual commodity that is made available, to the public to just come use and discard without any second thought for their feelings, their emotions, like any thoughts that they have. It's just kind of like, you are just a body, you perform. I don't think people really, truly, most people can appreciate it until they've lived that experience firsthand, or, if they are a very empathetic person. I know, we look at studies and they find time and time again after every study that men far outnumber women in their support for the prostitution system. But I think also too, like, they're there, for what they call entertainment, right? This is adult entertainment, which was exactly how that ad in the newspaper got me. It marketed exploitation as adult entertainment. But like, I wasn't entertained there. I was the entertainment. And when you are just so dehumanized and really taken down to your very bare bones, like, oh, your breasts are too small, oh, you're a little bit too thin or too overweight, oh, you're this, you're that. Like, we can't seem to appreciate how strong of an impact that has on women when there isn't that removal from, what is actually being sold. Like, when people try to say, well, it's just like, shining someone's shoes, or I don't know, serving tables in a restaurant. Like, we all use our body for labor. And it's like, okay, but your body is the product. Like, and when these guys are purchasing a product, they are purchasing you, and they will be critical of you because they really want to have, in their mind, value for money. So the blows that happen to women's self-esteem and self-worth, and then the competition amongst each other. Why didn't I get chosen? What does she have that I don't have? It's just a horrible environment for women's mental well-being. And, beyond that, it's also bypassing authentic sexual consent, which by its very nature has to be freely given and enthusiastic. So there's, myriad reasons why it's just toxic all around, but people, for whatever reason, just can't seem to get on board with appreciating that. And that's the hardest part about doing activism in this space.
What do you make of the women who may or may not still be in the sex industry, but who present themselves as being freely consenting and supportive of decriminalisation or legalisation of the industry?
I never want to speak for all women and pretend like I know everything about them.
Mm.
But it seems like when I meet women like that, when I have known women like that, over the years, they seem to be sad on the inside. Like they still seem to have low self esteem, low self worth. They have this defeatist mindset that, well, that's just, the plight of women and that's just how men are going to treat us. So I might as well capitalize on it. And I just it breaks my heart because there's like I'm like deep down in you, like there's a fire. I know there is, but they all just seem to be flatlined. They seem to be numb. And I talk about that in my InSTEP paper as well, about being numbed out. And for many years, that's what happened to me once I adopted sex work ideology, because the trauma and the dissociation was hitting me, and it was so intense, and I had a nervous breakdown only a few months into prostitution. I took a break for about a week, and when I returned to the brothel, I was the empowered sex worker. And I don't know, what happened. I didn't, suddenly read something or change anything, but it was almost like my body was like, okay, you're going into protection mode now.
Mm.
And I imagine that's the same thing as like men in military, right? You kill a few people, and after that, you have to either numb out or you're going to be your own next victim. And so I think a lot of these women, it's probably something that's done subconsciously, that they're just almost in this state of numbness and like trance, like self, survival. Because if they truly felt every, touch of that man and internalized it, and truly internalized every word that these guys say to you whenever they're using your body, all the verbal abuse, you can't survive that kind of environment. So I think it's much easier to just revert to this, well, I choose it. I'm not a victim, because nobody wants to be a victim. And it also is a great marketing tool, because I like to believe that men want to buy the lie and they think, well, okay, I don't want to be an abuser. I've heard about trafficking. That sounds horrible. But I want to buy the woman who likes this.
Mm.
So, I know a lot of women, tons of us, that all said, I choose this. I like this. It's better than any other job. And we said that until we were out. And then once we were out, and after, some therapy and a long stretch of time, that narrative starts to change. That's when you can start to be a little bit more gentle with yourself and honest with yourself, and really own what is the violations, what has happened to you over that time.
I've noticed that the women who talk about abolition of the sex industry publicly as survivors, they do tend to be a bit older. There's normally a little bit more of time has passed since they've exited. And maybe that's, as you say, it's this process of coming to terms with what happened to you that takes some time. I mean, ditto with domestic violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Women who've just left an abusive boyfriend aren't going to go and start doing kind of campaigning, get up on stage or whatever. There's a period of psychological adjustment.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a grieving, it's a grieving of everything that you once fell for and bought into so deeply. And I've talked about this before, about the system as a form of thought reform, as like cult-like tendencies to it. And I see that, with a lot of these really neoliberal, ideologies, is that they really do prey upon people who are immature and people who are very impressionable. And like you said, you're not seeing usually, 20-year-olds who have been in the prostitution system running out to then denounce it, because there is, like I said, that grieving period of like, who am I? Who was I? I have to lose that. But at the same time, I have to integrate that into my new identity. How do I do that? Who am I now? Like it's this mashup of like many pieces of you trying to come together in some kind of healthy way, when you've been so fragmented in your identity because you've had to dissociate in those rooms with those men. So it's, yeah, Rebecca Mott, who's a UK survivor, she said, that for her as well, like, she's talked to a lot of exited women. She said it takes, it seems, about 3 to 7 years for women to leave prostitution and really understand what has been done to them, and put it in context and heal enough that they can come forth encouraged to share those experiences. And, for me, it really took me, I'd say probably in total about 3 years of deprogramming. The last 2 years that I was in prostitution, I was very fortunate, that I, like I said, went back to college. I was able to pay tuition. And part of my studies were violence against women. And one of the very first papers I read was Bad for the Body, Bad for the Heart, which is a paper that Dr. Melissa Farley wrote. And it talks about, the harms of prostitution. And, I also read some of Rebecca Mott's work. She had a blog, a really fantastic blog that she ran in those years.
I remember it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Annie Lobert, she had put out that documentary about the Vegas Strip and, her work with Hookers for Jesus, trying to reach the women and stuff. So, it's a lot of work to unpack everything, I think. And yeah, it's like I said, they just prey on the immature and the impressionable because those are easy victims.
I spoke recently to a woman called Brooke Urich, who used to be a sugar baby and also works for a sugar baby website. So she both did, she's quite clear. It's like, it's prostitution. She both did prostitution and then also kind of worked behind the scenes in recruiting more women. And she's written a book about it. And one of the things that really jumped out actually at me when reading her book, when speaking to her, was how naive these girls are who sign up to these things. I mean, we know that, right? But one of the things that really surprised me was how incredibly susceptible they were to financial scams. So the men on these sites will try and scam them with the most stupid scams, like the really, 101 kind of stuff, the sort of stuff that you would normally only be able to trick like an elderly person, right? And yet these 18, 19, 20-year-old girls were falling for it and were losing large sums of money. And I guess it's because they were basically being selected for naivety, or they wouldn't have been on the site in the first place. But like profound naivety, which is quite hard, I think, for people who are not naive to really grapple with. It's quite, I think you need quite a high level of theory of mind to understand it.
Yeah, that really doesn't shock me at all. Like, I know I've been scammed in prostitution, and I can think of so many other women that were as well. Like, and very elementary things too. Like you said, like intricate folding of paper bills of money where, because I was just so gentle with these abusers for whatever reason, because you're in that fawning stage, right? And you're trying to appease them because you want them to go back to these escort review boards and write nice things about you so that you can make more money because you're so deep in debt. And so you don't challenge these people. You kind of, you're a little bit scared of them, but you also want them to like you. And so you really just kind of let them take the lead. And I think, women in general do that in society just because men are typically bigger and stronger than we are, that it naturally puts us into this situation of being timid around them. And, of course, we can try to take self-defense classes. We can try to, become more confident. Like myself, even when I was in prostitution, I had already a black belt in karate. I'd been training as a martial artist for 10 years, but it really changes when you're in a locked room alone with a guy who is, twice your size and is looking at you like you're his next meal. And that really no one's going to come help you because there's only, 3 other women in that space who are like 110 pounds soaking wet and are probably going to run out scared if a man attacks rather than come to your rescue. So, there's when people say like, oh, you didn't have to do those sex acts with that guy, or you could refuse to stay with that man. I don't think people can understand that dynamic, that power differential that is existing in these systems, and how women just are like, okay, I'll just do whatever I have to do. And of course there's that pursuit of money, right? I'm so desperate in money. I hope this is real. I hope this is true. We'd have guys that would tell us like, hey, come and do a photo shoot for this website. It'll just be POV shots, point of view. So we'll just, zoom the camera in only on your genitalia while you're on top of me having sex, and we won't, pan up to your face. Next thing you know, you're in this room, there's hidden cameras everywhere. They've fully recorded everything about you. you don't know where that content ends up. And then they say, okay, we're going to wire you the money after. And then you never see them again. So
Mm.
like these types of things are so common because women want to believe that, people wouldn't treat them that way, because I really don't think that the women in prostitution would treat anyone else that way. We have this reputation of being like these evil, greedy women, but I really found that the women in prostitution, the ones that didn't deeply adopt the sex work ideology, were really some of the kindest, most gentlest women I have ever met, and would give you the shirt off their back, because they too have been in those really bad situations where they just needed someone to be there and help them. And so they do that for you in return. And so I think they're just really taken aback, as I was every time. I think like, how could these guys have done that to me? And then now whenever I leave the system and I've been out, I'm like, oh, it makes total sense why they did that. They're predators, they're objectifiers, they're abusers. Like, why wouldn't they do that to me? It was
Mm.
a place where it was easy to find a victim and easy to get away with it, because nobody really cares about these women and their well-being either.
Am I right that you did? How long were you in prostitution?
7 years.
Am I right that you did what would mostly be regarded as kind of high end
Yeah.
stuff?
Yeah.
How different does that make one's experience of it?
I used to think it makes a very big difference. Like when I replied to that ad, I used to think, wow, I was so lucky. I actually didn't know, but I was replying to the best top brothel in the city at the time. I'm so glad I didn't end up at one of the, scummy brothels.
Mm.
But even still, that super high end brothel that I ended up in, it still had a mouse infestation. It was still quite nasty. There was still, men who would come in there and do gross things to us. There was still ripped up foam on the beds where there was, semen and blood and sweat and all the things that were, exposed. Still saw people with ringworm, with skin infections, scabies. Like it was really no different.
Mm.
But I used to think, wow, at least this place has like running water and at least this one has power, because some of them don't, right? They're really just slop job kind of brothels where people just want to exploit the women, make the money, and then close up shop because they know that they're probably eventually going to get, shut down, or
Mm.
somebody's going to get arrested because there's criminal involvement. But, over the years, again, with all this reflection that comes when we leave, I really started to realize like it doesn't matter if you're having sex in the back of a really gross, dirty, smelly vehicle behind a dumpster in an alley, or if you're in, these beautiful penthouse suites in these world-class hotels like I was. It's all the same. The trauma is the same. The unwanted touch is the same. The look in the men's eyes when they're consuming you and objectifying you, it's all the same. And Norma Hodling, deceased woman, a survivor who was also a police officer in San Francisco, who founded the John School there. She said, it doesn't matter if you're, giving oral sex behind a back alley dumpster or you're doing it in penthouse apartment or penthouse suites. Like you're still giving oral sex. Like at the end of the day, it's the exact same thing. And I've talked to trafficked women. I talked to women who were moved around in these really, scuzzy apartments, and our stories are the same. So it doesn't matter if you're laying on these satin sheets, and if you're getting more money, the money goes just as quickly. There's really no big difference that I've noticed. I would say that I think the only thing that is a little bit different at times is the level of violence. And of course, it's all violence, but I mean like the, aggravated type of violence that we were talking
Mhm.
about earlier. And I think that that's because the Johns, they know that the women who are on the streets are really in the most, precarious situations. They're truly the most marginalized women. And so they will target them for their really genuinely sadistic acts, because they think that no one's going to care about that young homeless Indigenous woman the same way as they are about the white college student who's licensed by their city to be in the brick and mortar brothel. So I'd say that's probably really the only big difference.
Indigenous women are massively overrepresented, aren't they, in the Canadian sex industry?
Yeah, yeah. In trafficking they are, but when it
Mm.
comes to, this so-called sex work, this autonomous area, if you want to even call it that, they're not in the licensed areas because there's
Mhm.
that inherent racism in Canadian culture that Indigenous women are, savages or dirty or less than, like they're, not as desired as the Caucasian women. And so we see this embedded racism in these systems. And, we see that even in like Germany where it's legalized, like the mega brothels that have floors where it's like, okay, this floor is Nigerian women, this floor is Thai women, this
Mm.
floor is, Eastern European Bloc women. And yeah, it's, everybody has a different price. And, just once you see it and you can see like that, like I said, going back to the dehumanization, there's really no way to justify these systems. It's just robbing people of their intrinsic value as human beings.
You spoke about the fact that it was legalized, right? Is it still, what is the status quo legally in Canada nowadays?
When I was in prostitution, the act of actually having sex for money was not illegal, but
Mm-hmm.
everything basically around it was. So
Mm-hmm.
again, like having a brothel was illegal, public solicitation was illegal,
Mm.
profiting off of somebody else's sex so-called services was illegal. And so in 2013, those laws were found to be unconstitutional because apparently they violated the life, liberty, and security of so-called sex workers. So Parliament then was given 1 year by the Supreme Court to draft new legislation. And if we didn't, then we would have had full decriminalization. There just would have been no laws on the books. So thank the creator, the universe. So grateful that in 2014, at the end of 2014, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act came into effect in Canada, which is an abolitionist model that criminalizes the buyer and the profiteers and exploiters, but makes exempt from prosecution the sellers.
Mm.
And it's quite a beautiful model. It allows for co-op arrangements, so women can collectively come together and operate out of an apartment if they want to, or a space. Whereas, in other countries that have adopted this model, they can't do that because they're seen to then be, collaborating basically or profiting off of each other.
Mm-hmm.
But so I think our law, which came into effect, like I said, in 2014, we were the fourth country, I think, after Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. But I think, our legislators really did a great job in researching those three models or three countries that had already introduced the model, and kind of saying, how can we make this the best that we can to respect the rights of those who say that they want to do this and so-called choose to do it, but also protecting, the vast majority of people in prostitution that we know would exit if they had the opportunity to. So I think it's a great model, but unfortunately, it hasn't been universally endorsed or enforced in our country. We're not seeing, any exited services really whatsoever.
Mm.
It's really quite disheartening, and now we're at risk of losing it to a alliance of 23, 22, or 23 so-called sex worker organizations that are fighting very aggressively in the courts to get full decriminalization.
What do you think is going on with these sex worker organizations? Are they actually, trade unions composed of sex workers, or is it more dubious than that?
It's both. There's some that are truly grassroots that I think are
Mm-hmm.
just, well-intentioned women that are in prostitution that have fallen privy to the ideology and
Mm-hmm.
think that they can, as we all thought, think that they can mitigate away harm by, having licensing or, checking the IDs of these men or, whatever may be, things that we know have been proven to be faulty and ineffective.
Mm.
And then, of course, you have some that are more dubious, like you said, that are owned, they're organizations that are operated by brothel owners and profiteers, and they're in it strictly for the profit motive. And we never seem to know who funds them as well. Like, it costs a lot of
Mm.
money to push forth charter challenges in Canada, and there's a lot of secrecy about who exactly is putting this money forth. And, we've kind of heard through the grapevine that it's a lot of sex buyers who are quite wealthy and, throw somebody $1 million to go towards the cause. And,
Mm.
there's very little transparency, but very, very concerted effort, especially with controlling media, to try to shift that public opinion. Because surprisingly, in Canada, when people are given the full information about our law, about PASEPA, they actually really support it. There was a study done a few years ago I think it was done by London Abused Women's Centre, and they found that Canadians were 5 times more likely to support our abolitionist model than they were full decrim when they understood the full nature of it.
Mm.
But of course, people don't ever get to that point, right? It's a very complex topic. So they just read the headlines and it says sex work is work. sex workers want rights, and they're like, oh yeah, everybody deserves rights, I'm on board with that, I support that. And they can't understand the complexity and like what's actually being proposed, which would be a huge market expansion in Canada when we don't have the resources to deal with that kind of fallout.
Because one of the big issues, right, is, as you say, market expansion. Like, men are more likely to buy sex under certain legal models than others. And so if you have a higher proportion of, let's say, Canadian men buying sex, that demand has to be met. And so you'll end up with basically more women having unwanted sex,
Yeah.
which is a bad outcome.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. When more men are, emboldened to buy sex and there's no repercussions and nobody checks that and holds them accountable for the harm, well, of course there's going to be more men that want to do that, right? When there's no kind of constraint, no restraint put against them on that. So, yeah, they found there was a study, I can't remember the exact year of it, but they studied 150 different countries and they found that demand jumped, like it skyrocketed where prostitution was made legal or fully decriminalized. Like it makes that favorable conditions. And of course, once men want to buy sex, well, you got to find women to fill those brothel beds. And we know that a lot of women are only turning to this out of desperation. They don't genuinely want to be there, and for many of them, they're trying to get out as quick as they can. And so how do we fill those beds? We get traffickers to fill those beds. And, and then of course everyone's, oh, fight trafficking, but don't fight demand, not realizing that, we have to address demand because human trafficking laws, they don't apply to buyers. There's some countries like Germany, and I think Finland tried to do it a couple times, but I know Germany did do it. They created legislation that basically said, you can buy sex, but if you buy sex from a trafficked person, now you've committed a crime. So it's like, how do you attain that understanding? Like, how do you get that burden of proof met to show that a John knew that a woman was trafficked? Because no woman's going to say, oh, hello, John, welcome to the brothel, by the way, I'm trafficked. And then, like it just doesn't, it's not sensible. And so these, buyer as a party to trafficking type laws are just so completely outlandish. And so we have to understand that there's this, connection to prostitution, to demand and to trafficking. Like, my friend Paul Brandt, who does a lot of wonderful work here in Canada, he says you can't pick up the stick without picking up both ends of it. It's, they are different. They're different ends of the stick, but they're the same stick. Like, it's all trafficked women are being sold in the brothels just alongside these so-called sex workers. And here in Canada, we have a very low conviction rate for trafficking offenses. It's about 11 to 12%. Because again, that legal threshold is so high to meet on that charge. And that demand, like I said, it drives trafficking. So ending demand is really the key to ending trafficking, because women are still exploited and harmed outside of situations where they're trafficked as well.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.